Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is a Ukraine War Frontline update for the 14th of July 2023. Before we go to the frontline, I want to just refer to the Institute for the Study of War American military think tank concerning their preamble, and there's a lot of preamble in today's report, preamble concerning Major General Ivan Popov, this military figure who was pretty critical about the military situation for the Russians, that there's this lack of, well, we'll talk about that in a second, but the fallout from this and what it represents. So the ISW says Popov stated that Russian command fired him for expressing grievances over the lack of support for Russian forces and replaced him with Lieutenant General Denis Liamin. Popov claimed that he expressed concerns to the highest level of Russian command over the lack of Russian counter-battery warfare capabilities, absence of artillery reconnaissance stations, significant Russian casualties from Ukrainian artillery fire, and other issues. Popov claimed that Shoigu fired him because his honesty in voicing various problems in the Russian military threatened the Russian command. Popov claimed that he chose to quote, call a spade in the name of his dead comrades instead of, quote, remaining in silent cowardice. Russian sources previously claimed that Chief of the General Staff Gerasimov dismissed Popov for expressing concerns over the need for troop rotations in western Zaporizhia Oblast amid Ukrainian counteroffensive operations. So there's lots to talk about what this kind of represents. Likely aware that a recipient of his message in the veteran community of the 58th CAA would leak the audio recording. In other words, he kind of knew what was going on here in terms of this getting out. Popov equated himself with a rebellion leader less than a month after a Wagner group rebellion, regardless of whether he intended for the recording to leak. Popov likely attempted to appeal to the Kremlin to partially or fully strip Gerasimov of command over operations in Ukraine. And Gerasimov may have tried to shield Putin from unwanted criticism to uphold Putin's ignorance by firing Popov before he could appeal directly to the Kremlin. What's really important about anything that happens like this, and I've talked about this at length before, is that Putin lives in an information bubble. So he doesn't use the internet, doesn't have a smartphone, he distrusts the internet, he thinks it's a CIA tool, which means whenever stuff like this happens, you don't even know that Putin knows that Popov has A, said this, and B, been fired by Gerasimov. He is having all of his information given to him by other people, and he cannot confirm or disconfirm this very easily at all. So the idea that Gerasimov would be shielding Putin from elements of this, it would be entirely plausible. Popov's attempt to directly appeal to Putin for support and his insubordination of Gerasimov's command is indicative of a pattern of corrosive behavior that has developed within the Russian command and the Russian forces fighting in Ukraine. This is so super important. And then it goes on to say later, Popov's dismissal over the issue of Russian casualties and reported complaints about lack of force rotations further supports ISW's assessment that Russian defenses in Ukraine are likely brittle. Okay, that I thought that was important to mention there. Kremlin reportedly ordered the detention and suspension as well of several senior military officers following the Wagner Group's armed rebellion on June 24th, supporting ISW's prior assessment the Kremlin likely intends to purge the MOD of figures viewed as disloyal. You put all of this together and things are not going well in the Russian military administration. This will then have effects on the battlefield and just shows a lack of cohesion, but also that there are those issues talked about, counter-battery issues, deaths, large numbers of deaths from Ukrainian artillery, no rotation. And then you look at things like, well, I'm going to just talk to you about something else to feed into this, right? So you might look at the map at the moment and say, actually, things aren't going great for Ukraine in certain positions. So it looks like the Russians are really trying hard up and down this axis to gain some kind of momentum there and redirect Ukrainian reserves. And we'll come on to evidence that in a little while. But also in terms of activity, maybe around Avdiivka, where they're pressuring, so on and so forth, and then even north of Bakhmut in the Seversk axis. So there are a number, and I'll show you lots of red arrows to suggest from Andrew Perpetua's mapping that the Russians are sort of, I don't know whether they're fully counterattacking, just probing, prodding, and getting the Ukrainians to think this is a perfect time to do that if the Ukrainians are in the midst of organizing a counter-offensive to keep the Ukrainians thinking. Now, just before I go to looking a bit further detail at these front lines, remind you that the blue line represents Andrew Perpetua, pro-Ukrainian mapper, with the Russian defensive lines, and the pro-Russian mapper, Surat Maps, is in red with their idea of where Russian defensive lines are. And in some places they differ quite a bit, and it's wondering what the explanations for that might be. And then I can throw in the 30th of May lines, the Russian defensive lines, as according to Deep State Map, the pro-Ukrainian mapper. As you can see, broadly in accordance with the mapping as it is at the moment. There isn't too much difference along this Luhansk line. We'll bring that up a little bit later. I just want to uh, then bring into bear this source that I was just reading from the Kiev Independent. Border Guard Service. So Russia pulls almost all its troops from Belarus as part of the latest military rotation. So talking about Popov saying that there are rotation issues, right? And then being dismissed for that basically and going AWOL. You then start seeing military rotation from Belarus, the Russian troops in Belarus. Now, Russia has withdrawn almost all its troops from Belarus, the State Border Guard Services spokesperson Demchenko said on July the 14th. Until recently, we estimated that Russia's number to be up to 2,000 soldiers, so far fewer soldiers there than there were previously. But now another rotation has taken place, and almost all Russian personnel has been withdrawn from the territory of Belarus. Now, this is really, really significant. So, and I don't want to just paint what could be challenging times for the Ukrainians. So the Russians will be talking about gains in Luhansk and difficulty for Ukrainian gains in a number of places, and perhaps Russian gains here and there. Right? Let's zoom out and look at a bigger picture understanding of what's going on. So we have all of what I've already said about Popov and the Russian military administration being in sort of chaos to some degree, and Wagner rebellion. We also have the idea that they're not rotating and now they are moving almost all of their troops out of Belarus. Why would they move almost all of their troops out of Belarus? Well, because actually they're not particularly needed there. There was talk about this being a potential point of attack for the Russians down south from Belarus. Now, they just don't have the numbers to navigate the difficult terrain here, the marshy terrain. You need lots of bridge laying equipment in the northern area of Ukraine. So there is no point in them being in Belarus. You need moving almost the entirety of the Russian forces out of Belarus signifies that the Russians do not have a depth of reserves. They are trying this crypto mobilization because they know they don't have the numbers of troops to adequately defend. They are trying these attacks in certain places, but I don't think they have the forces to sustain that, to go anywhere with it. Therefore, this is all about, yes, like ideally they would like the whole of the Donbass. That is just completely unrealistic. They don't have the reserves to hold on to these positions and maintain momentum. So I think these are really designed to keep the Ukrainians thinking about their own counteroffensive and moving reserves up to places like Luhansk. If we go to this Andrew Perpetua map, you can see, like, you look at this, you might start worrying. Now, again, I'm not painting this in a positive light. I'm not trying to look for a silver lining. I'm trying to understand genuinely what's going on. So we have, if you look at all of these red arrows here, we have a number of red arrows right up and down the Luhansk Oblast here, and then coming down into the Donetsk Oblast as well around Bakhmut. So this is a Seversk front, Russian attacks. This is the Kreminna area and the Serebyansky Forest and Bilohorivka, Russian attacks. Torska, Terny, Nevska up here, Russian attacks, and then up in Novoselivska, up here, and this is possibly around Ploshchanka, Popivka, north of there. Actually, yeah, that's north of there. So interesting. So anyway, a number of red arrows, which might make you start to really worry. Now, No Report said, and Russia is pressuring in Kharkiv and Luhansk. Russia has momentum near Kupyansk, Svatova and Kreminna, and appears to be launching attacks around Haliapole as well, and we'll come to that a little bit later. Russian source Romanov claims that the village of Novoselivska on the Svatova front came under Russian army control. Now, this has swapped sides a number of times. This village has changed hands a number of times, many times before, says Barracuda. If I remember correctly, Kraken Special Forces units captured it the last time, and it has remained that way since. I won't believe this news until there's visual confirmation. Novosibirsk is not a village that can be captured in a day. So there are these successes for the Russians in certain places. But I was reading somewhere else, and I can't find the exact quote now. But the idea is that this is being done to suck the reserves away from the Ukrainians. So it might be in this ISW summary for the whole region. So this goes on to say, Russian sources claim that Russian forces made territorial gains and conducted offensive operations near Kupyansk and Svatova. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces cut off Ukrainian ground lines of communication (GLOCs) in an unspecified area along the N26 Chuhiv-Milove highway, which passes through Kupyansk and Svatova, although Institute for the Study of War has not observed evidence corroborating these claims. Russian sources claim that fighting continued in Novosibirsk and that the front line now runs along the railway. Another Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces counterattacked near the forest belt in the vicinity of Novosibirsk railway line, and that Russian forces conducted offensive operations south of Novosibirsk and near the railway. So let's go and have a look at that. These are gains for the Russians, further gains for the Russians, as according to Syriac maps. Not seen that yet from Andrew Perpetua, but this is to the south of Novosibirsk and Kuzmivka. So the railway that they're talking about is this grey line coming down here that curves away and meanders south of Kuzmivka there. There's activity around the railway line, as we have seen over the last few days. The Russians have pushed across that and are now possibly in control of the first road also in Novosibirsk, while some are claiming that actually they now control the whole of Novosibirsk. So that would be quite significant for a day's work there. It could well be the case that that is true, and the Russians really are pushing in this area. The ISW goes on to say Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces advanced in this area, and that would create conditions for Russian forces to partially encircle Novosibirsk and develop further attacks towards Stelmakivka. Ukrainian military officials reported that Russian offensive operations near there were unsuccessful, as of course they would. So there's the idea that attacking to the north and to the south would enable Novosibirsk to be surrounded, and that would be a bit of a problem. The usefulness of Novosibirsk is in its being sat on this highway that goes from Svatova to Kupyansk, and indeed the railway as well. But of course, once you are that close, these are unusable anyway. So anywhere around here renders that road unusable. You want to be using that road even from this kind of distance. Really, it's under fire control, and that can be said for most of the way down that road. But anyway, nonetheless, ISW continues. Russian and Ukrainian forces engaged in positional battles near Kreminna. Yesterday, the Russian MOD claimed that Ukrainian forces unsuccessfully attacked Russian positions near Dubrovka and Kreminna, so that's Ukrainian forces attacking. Former LPR ambassador to Russia claimed that Russian forces engaged with the Ukrainian forces in Kreminna and Serebyansky Forest. A Russian blogger claimed that Russian forces continued assault operations near Torska, and this is the place that we saw yesterday. We talked about quite a bit yesterday. It's coming down south, past all these places where I've sort of mentioned Chervonopopivka, Ploshchanka, and then up here, Karmantianivka, where I think there's quite a bit of activity taking place at the moment. And then, as I said, Novosibirsk. So we've got Nevska to the east of Nevska, Terny, and Torska. And Torska is where there were claims yesterday that the Russians are in the outskirts of the suburbs of Torska. And there are counterclaims saying, no, it's all quiet then. They're not there. Then activity around Dubrovka and in the forest as well. A Ukrainian official observed that Russian forces are accumulating a powerful grouping of forces in the Kupyansk and Liman directions. Cherevati stated that Russian forces are concentrating airborne forces, unspecified infantry formations, bars, reserves, territorial defense elements, small private military companies like Veterani, PMC, and Storm Z assault groups in this front line. He also identified that the Chechen units are operating near Svatova, but noted that these forces are carrying out purely policing tasks. So it is all, there is quite a lot of force concentration in the area from the Russians right up and down this front line. But the argument is that even given this is the case, this is still mainly intended to disrupt the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which you can imagine it would be doing, right? The Ukrainians have a decision now whether to support their forces along this front line and where they get those supporting forces from. Now, you could say, right, okay, they've pulled out from Belarus, so we could take forces from the north here that might have been supporting the defense of that border and bring them to bear. I don't know if that's a doable thing, whether there are a large number of forces in the area, but there'll be border forces. So would you want to put them on the front line here? So probably not. I don't know. Or do you dip into that counteroffensive pot to try and support this, or do you ignore it and just say, "Hey, do what you can there. It's actually not so important. They can exhaust themselves, attriting themselves in attacking, and then that might leave them more vulnerable to a counterattack at a later point. But we leave that." You do the best job you can up there, guys. The existing forces you have, while we are continuing to concentrate in the places that we are. So that is kind of a synopsis of what is taking place there. I'm going to move on from the Kupyansk to Svatova to Kreminna front now and go to Bakhmut. Under the understanding that there's a lot of activity taking place down this Seversk front line as well, Avdiivka, and so on. And then we join the Bakhmut area, which has a further line, the yellow of deep state maps, which is a pro-Ukrainian map. Again, the Russian defensive line. Let's have a little look and see what the white line shows, and it shows that there have been these advances in the Klishchivka area, in the Bakhmut and Yahidna area, in the Kreminna area down south, and then to the north along the highway a little bit, but we haven't had too much of there the last few days, last week actually or so, and then north around Rozdilivka, where the Ukrainians are having some success too. I'll just get rid of that to give us I think it's probably easier to get rid of that. Right, now let's go on to see what's happening in Bakhmut. Some general claims. Here we have going to the south, which is Klishchivka. Today I received confirmation about the areas that were contested, which is these areas on the hills. Remember, I talked to you about how it is lower ground to the east in Klishchivka itself, and to the west you have higher ground with the trenches. But now can report that they are under Ukrainian control right now. Ukrainian controls the entrance to Klishchivka and big parts of the trench network, which is interesting because that's not all the trench network. And many claims that basically the Ukrainians control all of this area to the south. To the west of Klishchivka, which is south of Bakhmut. I'm getting myself all mixed up here. So if we come in to look at, I'm going to try and go 3D here and see if we can see the height difference. I don't know if that's easy to see because you kind of need to see the sky a bit to give you a sense of, yeah, it's not very easy to see. You kind of need to accentuate, which you can do, as I said yesterday, on the standalone program. But there is these heights there, and it comes down into Klishchivka. So you've got Klishchivka here, and then it raises up here onto these higher grounds. You can see over there, and there's a bit of a sort of gully through here where you've got the trees, but you can see this is all on higher ground. So this high ground is what the Ukrainians have been fighting over, and you have the trench networks that are built into that high ground, particularly around here. Now, the claim there is that they don't, well, the implication from no reports is they don't control all of the trench networks, and that could be because they're much more extensive. This is 2018 footage. There'll be many more trenches built all around here. So they might want to have control over this main one, but there'll be lots of others they don't. Now, Andrew Perpetua shows that on their mapping, his mapping, that the Ukrainians have made gains and are really on the outskirts of Klishchivka. Two areas of gains: this kind of forest area completely under control, and more of this forest area there just overlooking Klishchiivka. On the other hand, Surya Maps, a pro-Russian mapper, has some gains for the Russians in that area, which is kind of bizarre. So there's a little bit of disagreement there. So this is the claim that the Russians retook control over some high positions west of Klishchiivka, as you can see there. So that's what Surat maps have, and actually Surat maps has the Russians in control. This is not the grey zone. This is control of all of these heights around here. Now, all I can say about this is that this must be incorrect. Surat maps is there's no other way to say this, but I just think they're wrong. They're just plain wrong. And the reason is, well, lots of things. It's just lots of sources. Now, here's a Ukrainian bit of footage from that area that they're kind of talking, that Surat Maps is talking about here. We have a situation of overlooking these, overlooking some dancing going on. No, so overlooking some Klishivka here, which is on the lower ground, as you can see. I don't know if it's worth just me rewinding a little bit. So you can see looking over and down onto Klishchivka there and seeing all sorts of smoke. Now, as this all says, does that indicate retreat? Why would you have smoke? That's not smoke from bombing. That's almost certainly generated. You wouldn't have that much white smoke. That has been generated. So either the Ukrainians are attacking Klishchivka and are whacking it with smoke, but from this direction, you wouldn't have smoke there. You would have the smoke before Klishchivka, not in it. So the only other explanation is that that's being used to disguise a retreat. Now, if that's what's going on, I mean, that is smoke in Klishchivka right now, and you've got video footage that appears to be coming, I would suggest, actually from here, right, from the high grounds here down onto Klishchivka. I guess, I mean, it could be from over there. I'm just trying to work out, but it's much more likely that it's coming from this kind of direction. In which case, like this is Syria maps is just wrong. And if they're retreating, then they're definitely not making gains to the west. So, yeah, I would be really. I don't like going out on you know, I'm not going out on a whim here. It just doesn't make much sense to me. So we go back to on a limb. It's got words, man. So here is what ISW says about Bakhmut. Ukrainian forces continue counteroffensive operations north and south of Bakhmut and advance on Bakhmut's southern flank. That's according to the Ukrainians, according to Hannah Malia. Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces repelled Ukrainian forces from the heights near Klishchivka. Russian mill bloggers also claim that Ukrainian forces conducted attacks near Kreminna and Avdiivka and that fighting is ongoing near Bakhmut. So there are these claims that the Ukrainians are being repulsed from these heights, and that's probably what Surat Maps is referring to. But I don't think that those claims really concord with what my sense of what is going on in the area. Is it to cover retreat? Don't know. Yeah, as this person says, who's recording? If it's Ukrainians, then they seem to be only a couple of 100 meters away, assuming this is Klishchivka. So it does appear to be that, and it does appear to be Ukrainians. And if it is Russians recording themselves in Klishchivka, then what are they doing releasing all that smoke? And if that's the Ukrainians in there, then how are you Russian up here and the Ukrainians are attacking into Klishchivka? So this has to be a Ukrainian piece of footage looking down on Klishchivka. So anyway, that's Bakhmut. There's not too much information other than that coming out of Bakhmut. There are claims of advances in Kurdyivka. There will be activity going on in the north around Mosulivka and around Bakhmut. And one would assume here around Orakovo, Vasilivka and down the highway, but there's just no details coming out. There is a lot of operational security as well, So let's come out of Bakhmut and further down. We come to Avdiivka, and Surat Maps claims that there are some Russian advances in Avdiivka as well. Here we have so we can get rid of Bakhmut now. Here we have Surat Maps saying the Russian army has restarted operations on this axis, Vodyane axis, and retook the defensive system north of Vodyane. That's towards Severny. So we do know there has been fighting in that area over the last few days, And indeed, Andrew Perpetua shows here that, yeah, there is again red arrows all the way around Avdiivka and down to Mariinka and south towards Mykolaiv, Novomykolaiv, as well as north of Avdiivka as well. There's some Ukrainian uh, advances or pushing to the north of Avdiivka around Vesele, where there has been a bit of back and forwards. The Russians lost a lot of equipment around there, and it looks like the Ukrainians are pushing back, but the Russians are pressuring in a number of these places. Now, the ISW says Cherevati, spokesperson for the Ukrainians, reported unspecified Chechen formations. Oh no, this is still Bakhmut. And actually, I'm going to throw this in. I'm going to say this because uh, I talked about how the Ukrainians said that the Chechens are operating up near Svatova, but operating more like policemen. So kind of like, yeah, they're not really doing a really serious job up there of being in the army type thing. Cherevati then says that unspecified Chechen formations are operating near Klishchivka, which we just talked about, in an internal security capacity with no combat value. I think they're just taking opportunities to slag off the Chechens. Now, actually, I saw some video coming out earlier to say, actually, a lot of Chechens were against Prigozhin. There's video evidence to suggest they might be actually secretly kind of in support of Prigozhin's kind of aim. So there's some interesting stuff going on with the Chechens. A Russian mill blogger claimed that VDV divisions, so airborne divisions, are placing mines near Bakhmut every night and can install up to 400 mines in 2 hours. So this goes back to why the Ukrainians are making such slow progress in all of the areas of their counteroffensive. If the Russians can lay 400 mines in 2 hours in any given place, and that's 400 mines you have to negotiate broadly, or at least a bunch of mines you have to negotiate if you want to go through those areas, which they will do. This must be so difficult. Footage published on July 13th purportedly shows elements of other elements working in the Bakhmut direction. So there are still lots of forces up there. Anyway, I was talking about Avdiivka, and Evil Gherkin has said that Storm Z assault units continue to attack in the Avdiivka area in the industrial area zone. So I was just trying to work out what that would mean, because as far as I understand it, the industrial zone is this northern area. And we talked yesterday about how Lastochny, or Kurna, or however you pronounce that, the Ukrainians were attacking towards that. And I was thinking, well, they are attacking towards Severny. I know that because they've been doing that. And indeed, Surat map shows that there are some gains there. Towards there, that's a long way over a lot of built up fields, and really easy to get hit by Ukrainian artillery. So are they attacking from Krasnohorivka towards this industrial zone? I don't know. Storm said units are those convict units, so maybe they're just throwing troops in this direction. But yeah, that was the only sort of noteworthy thing from the ISW I saw. But yeah, it could be that the Ukrainians are under a lot of pressure to the south of Avdiivka. They're always under pressure in Avdiivka because it is this real meat grinder that often gets forgotten in comparison to Bakhmut. But there have been incredibly high losses for both sides in the Avdiivka area. And then we come on past Mariinka, where there's all that pressure, as we saw from Andrew Perpetua's map. So we're coming past Mariinka and then down past Pobieda to Novomykolaiv and Solodke, where Ukrainians might have been making some, or that were certainly active yesterday and the day before, and they've been active around Mikilska as well previously. Due to my frontline update being too long today, I've split it into two because I had quite a lot of analysis at the beginning. I'm just dealing with the eastern front line in this first video, and then I'll go on to the southern front line and Kherson in the next video. So apologies if you want it all in one, but just because it's a little bit unwieldy, I split it into two.